We're going to go ahead and reconvene because we know that this is a late night and we want to be sensitive to your time. As I mentioned earlier, I'm just so thrilled to have this panel up here as a resource for us as we continue to learn our rights. I've asked each of them, except Charlie, but I think he can wing this, but I've asked each of them to maybe you can reintroduce yourself if you'd like, and then to say just a few words about the work that you do and the organization that you represent. And I'm going to start with Donna.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to come out tonight. We certainly appreciate it, and thank you to the ACLU that decided to co-sponsor this event and put it together with Mason Dreamers. I'm Dana Chavez Calvi. I'm the current external president of Mason Dreamers, a student organization at George Mason University that aims to create a more inclusive environment for undocumented students through education and advocacy. Our work is within the university, making sure that certain rights or funds are available for undocumented students or documented students. And within the external portion, it's more of connecting with prospective college students, letting them know that they do have possibility to access a higher level education, whether it is at Mason or any other entity that they would like. An immigration status essentially should not determine their future. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Serene Shabaya. I'm a civil rights attorney in Washington, D.C., and my work focuses on the intersection of civil rights, immigration issues, and sometimes criminal justice. I'm formerly of the ACLU of Maryland and CARE Coalition, and lately have also been working with a group of people that formed a coalition called the Dulles Justice Coalition to provide support to people who are affected by the travel bans. And so we've been actually physically at Dulles Airport for a long period of time, and now we're drawing down our physical presence, but still kind of focusing on helping people who need support because in one way or another, they or their family members have been affected by the travel ban.
Hi, my name's Nick Merritt. I'm a staff attorney with the Legal Aid Justice Center, a statewide organization that gives free civil legal aid to low-income people throughout the state of Virginia. I work for the Immigrant Advocacy Program, which, among other things, has had a project for unaccompanied minors from Central America to get them permanent residence when they qualify. My boss, I'm proud to say, was the attorney who brought one of the first cases against the new administration on the travel ban, and we were able to get 2 green card holders who had been deported. They were Yemeni, but they were deported to Ethiopia for reasons I won't get into. But anyway, to get them back into the country and get their green cards restored. So I wasn't on the legal team for that. Immensely proud to be part of that work. And yeah, they did. That's true. The on behalf of 2, and then 7 came that's back. Right. The Al-Amrisi family as well. Anyway, so we're doing great stuff for immigrants. Right now, we're noticing that it looks like a lot of immigrants are getting deported out of, or are getting transferred out of the immigrant detention centers into the immigrant detention centers in Virginia to places elsewhere in the state. So we're gearing up to do Know Your Rights and raids defense for possibly another round of raids to come. I'm very proud to share the stage with everyone here, particularly Mason Dreamers. Y'all are my heroes.
Yeah, and again, I'm Charlie Schmidt, Public Policy Counsel. One of my primary jobs is to focus on the State General Assembly, and what we've seen in the last several years, but certainly this year, and we'll anticipate more next year, is the spillover effect of federal policy that comes down to state policy. So you get bills by local delegates and senators that want to ban sanctuary policies or want to confuse or conflate or try to give more power to local sheriffs to hold people on detainers when that's unconstitutional. There's just a lot of bad policy and bills that come out, and so we try to hold the line at the General Assembly along with Legal Aid Justice Center and others to just say, don't do that, right? And what we're also seeing is we've also really focused right now on 287G agreements. Anybody know what those are? Yeah. 287G agreements, we're trying as best we can to convince or at least compel local law enforcement not to enter into these agreements. Just really quickly, they're basically an agreement between, let's say, a local sheriff. Right now there's one pending in Fauquier County. The local elected sheriff has decided he wants to enter into a 287G agreement. That means that he basically says, hey, ICE, come on into my jail, help train one of my deputies. Then they will be deputized as an ICE agent so that someone is arrested whose status is already checked and already notified ICE, but they have the additional burden if they come through that they'll meet with that deputy, and that deputy has the power to issue a detainer or start the removal process, and it's sort of an expedited process. What we've seen in the past is that it's a terrible idea. It opens up liability, it opens up cost, and so we're trying to go around and mobilize grassroots organizations, participants, and really explain to these sheriffs that it's a terrible, terrible idea. There's one in Prince William County. There's another one pending in Fauquier County, and the current administration has said they're going wholeheartedly to reinvigorate these sort of agreements that deputize local law enforcement to do ICE's bidding, and so watch out for that.
So given I have the mic, I'm going to ask the first question because one of the things we talked about is, one, it's important that we all know our rights, but we also have been really recognizing that asserting your rights, flexing your rights matters differently for different people. And so, I don't know, Nick, Serene, maybe you want to talk about what we've talked about already tonight and the videos we've seen. What might you say differently if you were going to give advice to someone who doesn't have papers or who is vulnerable in some way to flexing their rights?
Yes, we'll pass it back and forth. So I'll start by saying one thing that everybody should know who isn't a non-citizen, which is that state and local law enforcement don't have the authority to arrest you because of an immigration issue, right? So in theory, if they are actually observing the law, local police, based on a Fourth Circuit case, don't have the right to ask you for your immigration status. And if they do find out about your immigration status in some other way, they don't have the independent authority to arrest you or stop you for that reason. And I think everybody who's a non-citizen should know that, because sometimes people give information because they feel that they're compelled to give that information, even when the person who's asking them for the information doesn't even have the right to be asking for that information. So that's one thing that I will say, just kind of as a pointer for people who are non-citizens. Another thing I will say is that, you know, if you have immigration documents that have been issued to you, you must carry them with you. I know this, I was an immigrant for many years before becoming a US citizen, not very long ago. You have to carry your documents with you that have been issued to you as an immigrant. But if you do not have documents, right, like if you're undocumented, you don't have lawful immigration status, you don't have documents that have been issued to you, if you're asked about your immigration documents, you can exercise your right to remain silent. Right? So that's a place where you can use some of those terms that you've been practicing, right? I am exercising my right to remain silent. I would like to speak with an attorney. Because as soon as you make an admission about your immigration status, that's already enough reason to potentially place you in removal proceedings. So I'll say those two things. There's a lot more that can be said, but I think Nick maybe can say some more stuff, and then we can pass it back.
Nope, that was it. Well, those are the main points that I would hit. Also, if you have documents that aren't real documents, don't carry those around with you. Don't use them. Some people have fake documents that they use to work, or for a driver's license from a state that they don't live in. That's a recipe for trouble. So yeah, the document asking for can I see some ID? We're just so trained to obey and be obedient because we think that it's going to make things go easiest for us. If you have papers, it's usually a good idea. There's it's one thing to show the cops or ICE in particular your ID, but ICE basically can get if they can get an admission out of you. It doesn't matter whether that admission is with spoken words or with the words on your ID that says matrícula consular or pasaporte salvadoreño or whatever you have that's some other than U.S. ID. So don't show your papers. Say, no, I would like to speak to a lawyer. Stop questioning me.
I have a feeling that there might be some questions in the audience, and so I'm happy to open this up and we can just engage in a dialogue. Yeah.
Hi. So on Friday, I live in Arlington. There was a meeting with the with people, or 40 people in Arlington, and the police chief and the sheriff. And one of the things they said was, I don't know how true it was. So I was wondering if you knew the law of Arlington or if you could verify this. They said ICE is permitted to enter the Arlington jail in order to interview individuals who are subject to deportation. But they said they do not. You just said that local authorities cannot make any criminal charges for deportation related. So are they lying? Is that like, do you know the answer to that question?
It sounds like what you're asking is, can the Arlington police let ICE into the jail to interview people?
Can ICE just go in?
Can ICE just go into a local jail? Theoretically, they're going to need to get some kind of permission from either they're going to have a warrant or they're going to have the permission of the local jailer. But generally, relations between the federal and state law enforcement agencies tend to be pretty cozy, I'd say. So I think that the odds of the Arlington Sheriff's Department or police, I'm not sure who runs the jails, and the Sheriff's Department taking a stand for local government and keeping those ICE agents out of the jail is pretty slim. So, they don't have the right to keep them out, but I don't know if it's a lie. Anyway.
I was just going to say. Well, just real quick, the analogy we use a lot of times is, and when we're talking to local law enforcement, particularly the sheriffs, that, there's cooperation and there's obstruction. Think of that sheriff, that local law enforcement is standing in a doorway, right? They don't have the right to hold the door closed because that would violate federal law. They can't hold the door. They can't obstruct. That'll get them in trouble. And now apparently that may even jeopardize their funding, right? But the idea is that they don't necessarily have to open the door, so to speak, and cooperate so wholeheartedly. So through either 287G agreement or other, there may be an actual jail agreement to hold people, and don't want to get into that. I mean, we can get into the minutia of that, but
I'm just going to gloss that a little bit because there's been a lot of discussion about like sanctuary cities, quote unquote, and whether funding can be taken away and what violates federal law. And I just want to be really clear. There are very, very few things that actually violate federal law that local law enforcement can do. It's entirely discretionary for local sheriffs to let ICE into their jails. They do not have to do that. They're under no obligation to do that. And there are many jurisdictions that say ICE cannot come into our local jails. And so if you have, the community support and the community buy-in to kind of go to your local jails and say, or your sheriffs or whatever, and say, do not let ICE into the jails, you can. Just for background context, there's a program called the Criminal Alien Program, which sounds very, very scary, right? Criminal, alien. That program primarily has captured people with very minor offenses or even no offenses who just kind of make their way to a local jail in one way or another. And the Criminal Alien Program, what it does actually is it stations ICE officials inside various state and local jails. Again, that program is not a mandatory program. There is no violation of federal law for any state or local law enforcement to say, we do not want you in our jails. If ICE has a warrant for someone, a judicial warrant, not a fake piece of paper that has warrant written on it, but an actual warrant where they went to a judge and presented a sworn affidavit that says, here is my statement of probable cause, and the judge looked at it and said, yes, there is probable cause, and returned a warrant. Under those circumstances, they have to hand someone over. But under all other circumstances, it's entirely discretionary. And in fact, there is a ton of case law saying that it actually violates the Fourth Amendment when state and local law enforcement detain people for extra time just because ICE asked them to, right? In Virginia specifically, most jurisdictions do this just as a matter of course, right? They detain everybody. ICE sends back these pieces of papers called detainers, which again, ICE uses these terms because in the criminal context, they usually mean something meaningful, like there's actually a warrant of arrest or a judge has looked at this. In the ICE context, they don't mean that at all. They're just pieces of paper that ICE employees write and issue, and they don't have the weight of law. And many, many courts of law have said that when you detain someone for additional time as a state and local authority, just because ICE asked you to and gave you this administrative piece of paper, you're actually violating the Fourth Amendment requirements of probable cause and judicial review in order to hold someone for additional time. So I just wanted to clear that up. On the question of depriving funds, what the law that everybody's talking about actually says is that if you're asked about the citizenship or immigration status of a specific person, you cannot stop someone from answering that question. But that's much, much narrower than, so essentially all of the places that are called sanctuary jurisdictions already obey that federal law. So I just wanted to put that out there to clarify. There have been a number of very, very thorough legal analyses that have been done, including 300 law professors who signed a letter explaining that all the stuff that's in the executive orders that says we're going to strip all these sanctuary jurisdictions of funding is actually illegal. They can't do that. And the irony is that one of the main reasons they can't do that is because of a case challenging the Affordable Care Act mandates, which found that you can't actually take a bunch of money away from jurisdictions just to force them to do what you want them to do. There has to be like a very specific tie between the money and the purpose and what you're actually saying. And by the way, the executive order itself says that there are exceptions for law enforcement purposes. And any of the money that could possibly fall into that bucket is gonna be in the law enforcement bucket. So all this to say, there's like a lot of threats and talk and all of that. I think if you are in a position to kind of advocate with your local sheriffs or your local law enforcement, it is not only reasonable, but fully legal, and also potentially saving them from liability for constitutional violations to encourage them to refuse to detain people for extra time just because ICE tells them to do that. Or sends them a piece of paper saying this is a detainer or this is an administrative warrant, and to actually require that ICE presents them with a judicial warrant, a warrant that is actually signed by a judge before they would actually detain someone for extra time.
Yeah, go ahead. Please.
At an airport, how can I reject to get my electronics searched at an airport?
Ooh, that is somewhat unsettled law. I think the best thing that I've seen online is recommendations that you don't take your particularly smartphone through the airport, through checkpoints, airports, or there's some other resources where you can talk about taking vital information off and then putting it back on when you get through. But as the case law stands now, airports are considered sort of outside the traditional warrant needed to search your phone. If a police officer just stops you on the street, wants to search your phone, they need a warrant to do that. Airports, totally different situation. It's still potentially being challenged. Our national office and other lawyers have said no, that they shouldn't be just searching everybody's phone at the airport. But in the meantime, the recommendation is that you don't take a burner or not a burner. Sorry. What do they call them? Temporary phone.
If you don't mind.
Burners.
Okay, that's good. And because none of us are actually realistically going to do that, because smartphones are just part of our daily lives, it's a very individual decision, sort of based on the information that you want to, like for better or worse, we all have to sort of make risk assessments about both what our level of risk is if we're a journalist, if we're somebody who's working on, sensitive topics like that, where we or an attorney, somebody who has information that they have a legal duty to keep confidential, or just secrets that they really want to keep confidential. It's a very personal decision. There's some great guides out there, including from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who have really good sort of, here's sort of like level 1, level 2, and like, DEFCON 10 or whatever if you really want to like travel with your electronics and not do anything. So assess your level of risk appropriately. There's a number of guides.
Yeah, I mean, I second the recommendation to look at the Electronic Frontier Foundation's materials. They're very comprehensive. But I guess I just want to say a couple of things about the airport context because it's such a specific context, right? So at the airport, if you're not a US citizen, initially, Customs and Border Protection can ask you about your immigration status, right? And they can ask you about things that are relevant to your admissibility into the country. So if they're asking you what your immigration status is or to show evidence of your immigration status, you essentially have to answer those questions and you don't really have a right to an attorney in that context. Once they start asking you questions that go beyond that, that probe into like, you know, other matters, like we heard a lot of stories about people being asked, you know, did you vote for, or not did you vote, but like, what do you think of Donald Trump? Or what are your views on X, Y, and Z? And in fact, they were asking a lot of people these questions. Once you start being asked about things that are not about your immigration status, when you're seeking entry into the country, you can ask for a lawyer. Functionally, what that means when you decide to assert that right is that you may be detained, you may be taken to a different place, and it may take time for you to actually get a lawyer, but that's one option. If you're a US citizen, you generally always have a right to a lawyer. And then as far as searches of electronics go, the current state of the law is that cursory searches without a warrant are allowed. So like they can take your phone and search it externally, but in theory, and again, I think I'm just kind of making a point of emphasis here that like there is no case law that says they can unlock your phone and take your passcode and look into it. There's just not yet case law that specifically says that they cannot. Right, so in the Ninth Circuit, there's case law that says that a cursory search without a warrant is okay at the border, meaning that they can look at the outside and et cetera. And so for that reason, the ACLU actually says in their most recent Know Your Rights videos on the subject that you do not have to provide your passcode, right? So if they tell you, I want to unlock your phone, give me your passcode, you have the right to say no. Again, we've said this many, many times, but I'll say it again. When you decide to exercise your rights, particularly in such a vulnerable context, particularly where there may be discretion to like let you in or not let you in, that's an individual decision that you have to make, which might have consequences. Even if you're a US citizen and you say, I don't want to provide my passcode, this might involve like additional time and waiting and et cetera. In the meantime, there are a lot of different things that people can do. I know that some people have to travel with their smartphones, for example, because they're working or other things. There are now a number of airports from which you cannot take your laptop or your iPad onto the plane. So like, you know, I think this is a very evolving area of law. There are certainly ways that you can save the information on your phone externally to an external, like a cloud or a drive or something that technological that I don't understand. But people say that you can actually do that and wipe the actual physical phone when you're going through a border, and that's one option. And again, it's not because people have something to hide, but because as we saw in the Flex Your Rights video, like you don't know what you're giving people when you tell them to search, and you don't know what, when you consent to a search, and you don't know what they might use as a pretext, something that you may not be aware of or that you might not, you know, have thought might come back to sort of haunt you in one way or another.
Very briefly, a good way to make sure that you that you are going to get your phone or other devices searched is if they ask you, can we search your phone, and you say yes. So don't consent.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, let me.
I have a clarifying question about airports. Are you saying that all airports or only airports where you're going through customs? Do you mean any airport everywhere or just border crossing? Is that, I mean, is that what you're talking about, going through, or are you just talking about crossing the US borders?
So that's a great question. It's an excellent question. I think there are a couple of things to be said about that. One is ports of entry generally have certain diminished constitutional protections. I mean, this is something obviously that a lot of organizations, including the ACLU, continually fight. But the reality is that wherever there's something that qualifies as a port of entry, there is a 100-mile zone around that. It's a crazy large amount of space, but it's a 100-mile zone where certain protections are diminished. So certainly when you're at a port of entry or around a port of entry, even if you're not coming in internationally, there's greater rights, I guess, to search you without necessarily having probable cause. Like reasonable suspicion might be enough, or in some cases just they can search everybody to a certain degree, right? Even at airports, even at ports of entry, for example, if you're going to be selected for a search, there has to be reasonable suspicion, but they can search all your stuff and effects and external and all that kind of stuff without any further justification. When it comes to the question of crossing a border, like coming in from internationally, that's when they can ask you about your immigration status and et cetera. But if you're on a domestic flight and you're going from, let's say, DC Reagan National Airport to San Francisco or whatever, Customs and Border Protection does not really have jurisdiction to be asking people about their immigration status there. And that's one of the reasons many of you might have seen the stories that were going around about the flight that was stopped. I can't remember now which airport, but there was a domestic flight where Customs and Border Protection essentially boarded the flight and asked everybody coming out for their identification. And just as a hint about what constitutional experts think about the constitutionality of that, the ACLU has actually put out calls for anybody who was on that flight to to contact their national office because they are looking at the situation very carefully. If you're a U.S. citizen, if you're in a place where you're not a vulnerable person, you're comfortable kind of being an ally, you don't actually have to, if Customs and Border Protection on a domestic flight asks you for your identification, you do not have to show that identification. You do not have to show proof that you're actually a U.S. citizen in that context. That being said, again, having your rights, asserting your rights, two different things. But I think that's essentially what they were doing is I think they were trying to look for somebody who they thought was undocumented. And so they kind of were looking at everybody's identification documents, even though they actually didn't have the right to compel anybody to show those documents. The funny part about that is when they were asked about it later, they said, no, we were just asking people to consensually give us their documents. We were just asking them to consent to give us their ID. Nobody there was actually compelled to give ID, but obviously in the situation, it was clear that people were being compelled to show their ID, and it wasn't lawful. So, I think that's a very good point of clarification. There's definitely a difference between what Customs and Border Protection specifically can ask you, if you're coming in from an international flight or if you're just on a domestic flight. But as far as kind of security issues and searches and et cetera, there's a lot of latitude to search and to maintain, a certain kind of security zone at ports of entry generally, even if you're not specifically coming from an international flight.
Yeah. My name's Steve Levinson. I am the president of the board of directors of the ACLU of Virginia. I just want to, first of all, you deserve a round of applause. That's good stuff. Serene, seriously, that's a lot of things we were sitting here talking about. She got it. I just want to make one point, going back from the airport for a minute. We are all focused on what's happening across the river, all right? My advice to you is don't look over there. Look here in Virginia. There's a lot of things Charlie can tell you as much as anyone. The terrible, terrible things that are going on or in Richmond. The bills that have been passed, thank God many of them vetoed by the governor. Thank God we beat a lot of them before they got to the governor, along with a lot of other groups. But the fact is that know your rights. What happens to Dreamers? What happens with 287Gs? What happens with all of those things affect you happens in Richmond. You need to, I hope you all join the ACLU, but whether you do or not, ACLUVA.org gives you all kinds of resources, all kinds of alerts. You can sign up for alerts, know what's going on in Richmond, know what's going on in Arlington. I just did a program in Fairfax last week. The sheriff wasn't there, but the sheriff got a whole lot of questions about, are you holding people beyond the 48 hours? Are you holding people without a warrant? By the way, it has to be a criminal warrant, not just a detainer that's for some minor civil violation. Thank God in Virginia, most of the sheriffs, most of the law enforcement people require the warrants. They're holding them. We don't have 287Gs except for Charlie said in one or possibly two situations.
Yeah.
Those are things that are important to you. Those are things that are going to affect people on a daily basis. So I just wanted to stop and make this local a little bit. Watch what's going on in Virginia. Watch what's going on in the legislature. Sign up for alerts. Look for the resources online. There's plenty of stuff. We have ways to answer your questions. So I just want to take the focus off of DC. I want to take the focus off of our current president. This is not anti-Trump. If Trump left tomorrow, we have a Secretary of Housing and Urban Development who equates slaves with refugees.
Yeah.
We have a Secretary of Education who, we have a Secretary of the EPA who doesn't believe in climate change.
Yeah.
So, you know, watch what they keep the focus in the right place.
Yeah. Thank you.
And keep the focus local.
Thank you. And to that end, thinking more locally, one of the questions I have is for Donna, just to put you on the spot a little bit. Because one of the things that, again, it's important to know rights, but I also want to be a good ally. And I want to know how to support people that I care about in the community that are more vulnerable than I am with regard to asserting rights and whatnot. And so I wonder if you could just share with us your thoughts about things that you worry about or ways that we can be a good ally to our documented and undocumented students on campus and in our community.
Okay, well, I feel like that was two questions, but one of them, first regarding the obvious things that we're afraid of right now, obvious one being raids. Personally, I'm not necessarily all that worried about myself. I'm more worried about my family, and that goes to speak, I think, for most of the documented population. So it's not only about looking out for dreamers. I'm sorry, I appreciate you all being here, but if you're all here because you only support dreamers, then I would ask you to reevaluate to what degree your commitment is to dreamers. Because you can't honestly tell me that you support me as a dreamer if you don't necessarily support or are in questioning my family. Because last I checked, they're the ones that raised me, and thanks to them, it's where I am now. So if you like me as an individual, you like my family. Now, in regards to other worries that we have, obviously the 287, the governor's race that's coming up in November, which is gonna tell whether certain things are still implemented for our population. In-state tuition is gonna be put in question. We're not necessarily granted, in-state tuition is not necessarily a law, it's an interpretation by the Attorney General, and that's something that people need to realize. Whether you are documented or undocumented, you could be doing something to make this go smoothly, or it can turn worse. If you can vote, go out and vote. If you can't vote, go and urge others to vote. But tell them to make an educated decision on it. I would encourage you not to necessarily force your opinion on them, just let them know the facts. Point them to the right resources. Don't allow them to rely so much on the media or what one person said and the other person said. It's like, no. You know, we're all grown up, I would hope. And we can make our own decisions based on what we see in actual facts. How to be a good ally? Well, the good thing is that you all have already taken the first step. You're here, you chose to be here. I know you all could be doing a lot of other things, but you chose to get educated, which is a great first step. It really is, but it shouldn't be the only workshop, the only event you attend, because there's a lot more information you could be learning at other places. So just continue paying that forward. You could also serve as a connector, not only to students, but to your community around. If you don't, we're not asking you to know all the answers to all of our questions, but we are asking you to have some sense of where can we find the right resource for this or the right resource for that. And then just be supportive to your student. If you deal with students on a daily basis, let them know you're there. You don't have to necessarily say, oh, I'm an ally, I'm for undocumented students. No, there's subtle ways that you could do that. You could show them a sticker. Mason Dreamers has stickers, shirts. Hey, if you guys want to buy them, they're $12 outside. Yay. But no, it's like I currently am working for Manassas City Public Schools. I'm loving it, but half of the kids there didn't necessarily realize that I was involved in this movement, and I don't ever want to necessarily put them on the spot or be like, well, I'm involved in this movement. No, but every now and then, I'll decide to wear this shirt. They'll see it and they'll be like, oh. And in ways, they don't come out and tell me, oh, I'm undocumented and this is my situation. No, slowly they warm up, and that's usually what happens, you know? They learn to trust you, so you have to build that trust and you have to earn that trust. But you can't expect somebody that's in dire need of help to be like, I'm in dire need of help, because a lot of the time it takes a lot for you to be on that sinkhole and to really stand up for yourself, because you don't necessarily just think about yourself, you think about your family. Because you being vocal about something means that you're putting them at risk as well. So yeah, just take those things into consideration, and yeah, and get involved with the government if you can. Voting or getting more education, yeah.
What would you advise the people in the agencies that actually work with the after school programs, and the kids say, I'm worried they're going to take my mommy or daddy away? What should that person on a ground level with that child, should they say, why don't you have mommy and daddy call this number? I mean, what do we say to these kids? Because they're scared, and we're seeing it. You know, the frontline people that are working with these undocumented children don't know what to say to them.
The first thing I say is that you're not necessarily the only one. You really aren't. In my case, I guess it helps because I can relate to them personally, but sometimes I don't opt to necessarily tell them, oh, I'm in this situation, sort of thing. But you just have to get them to understand that, how do I word this? A lot of the times being undocumented puts you in this isolation box, and you think it's the world's worst problem. And this is something I tell students all day, every day, when we're at the high school, when we're at the middle school, when we're doing outreach. It's like, last I checked, you have feet, you have hands. You should be thankful to be in this country because you already have one step up from half of the world that wants to be in this country. Just because there's certain legislations that are coming out, or certain threats that are coming out. I mean, threats are always gonna be here in one form or the other. This one just happens to be present right now. And you have people like myself, like yourself, backing them up regardless of whatever may happen. So just reassure them that regardless of whatever happens, I guess, their situation is gonna be okay. And I don't find it all that I wanna say I don't find it all that likely, but then again, that's me being hopeful that that child will go through that experience. So, I don't know if that kind of helped, but.
Absolutely. Sure. One thing to do, LAJC, Legal Aid Justice Center, and another of other wonderful community organizations, particularly here in Northern Virginia, we've been putting on Know Your Rights workshops for community members, and also sort of make a family preparedness plan for families, helping them particularly fill out what are called powers of attorney, where if X thing happens, if both parents are detained, or something similar to that happens, then sort of emergency powers are immediately sort of spring into action in a third person that the parents pick. So that's we're having one of those the day after tomorrow, on the 30th, and in Arlington, and then one on the 4th in. Oh wait, is it the 4th, Edgar, in Coolmore, and the 30th in Arlington? Correct. Okay, good. Got to check with that's Edgar Aranda, community organizer extraordinaire. One chair of the Virginia Coalition of Latino Organizations, and a coworker and a friend. Another thing I would encourage people to do is, I thank you so much for your perspective on this, is to remember that a lot of the solutions to these problems aren't legal solutions. There's not going to be a legal organization that we could call. I mean, talking about moving the focus away from sort of big national politics, I'd also just like to take some of the focus off of lawyers, because honestly, the reason why ICE has a sensitive locations policy isn't because, which by the way they can disregard whenever they want to, isn't because some lawyer or politician decided to pass a law making it so. It's because there would be a community outrage if ICE started going into schools and churches and hospitals and, please God, courthouses and arresting people. So really what the government's going to be able to do is bounded in some ways by the law, but it's also bounded in some ways by what people can get away with. So it's really important for families who are in the situation when children are coming to you and saying, I don't know what to do. What am I going to do if I come home and my mom and dad have been taken away? Help them connect with other children and other people who are in the same situation. I am not I'm not a counselor, but there are counseling resources. Yeah, there are definitely resources that children who are afraid in this kind of trauma. This is something which is really seen a lot of times in countries that are going through things like war, that are going through things like civil unrest and cultural devastation. This is the kind of stuff that's being visited on communities right now. Just this level of fear, and make no mistake, this is intentional. This is to
Police officer
sure
is called to a scene, and a third party says
I
to
feel like
the
I'm in law
police,
school again. Okay,
yeah,
great.
a third party
Yeah,
says
thanks.
to the police officer, this person is undocumented.
Uh-huh.
Does the person that's being pointed at, can they leave?
Any criminal attorneys want to field that one?
I mean, so I think it depends on the specifics of the situation, but I will actually, I'll just say, if it's state and local police, they shouldn't be enforcing immigration laws, right? So like, even if someone points to that person and says this person's undocumented, state and local police should not be taking any action because of that. And so this is like one instance where if people are there and they are not vulnerable and they're able to witness the situation and take a video of it and maybe upload it to the mobile justice app so that somebody on the other end can see that state and local police are, inappropriately engaging in immigration enforcement, that's one thing you can do. Another thing I would just note is there's another magic word, which I don't know if it was up there before I came because I came in a little bit late, but it's asking, am I detained or am I free to go? Right, I mean, you can always ask that question. And if the person who's just pointed to doesn't have anything to do with the incident that just happened, in all likelihood, there's no reason for them to be detained. Like if it's just some random thing where there's police and someone points and says that person is...
Are female and they're victims of domestic violence. And their spouses bring them over here and then say, well, I'm a citizen, but you're not.
Yeah. Well,
So
yes. So, I mean...
I can beat you, and then
Yeah.
if the police come, I'm going to tell them to take you away. And these women believe that. So we're trying to educate them and say, no, if the police show up and you have the bruises, if you don't want to get the police involved, you may go across the hall to your sister neighbor's house and you do not have to talk to the police.
I mean, one thing to know is that if you are a victim of domestic violence or a victim of trafficking, there are special visa categories that apply to you. And so... Exactly, right. I think it's a very tough call because if the police perceive you to be fleeing a scene, that can go very badly for you, even if you're the victim. They don't have to talk. Right. They just say, I want an attorney. Yes, they could just say, I want an attorney. They can say that they're a victim of a crime. And, again, this is a very, very specific thing. Every police department deals with this differently. I know that some departments have policies in place specifically for victims of domestic violence. And so this is just a question where you have to learn, like, what are the policies of your particular police department? Does this police department have policies that if you're a victim of domestic violence, you're not going to be asked about your immigration status? You're not going to be, if that's the police department you're talking about, then that person can talk to the police. And generally speaking, victims of crime, do better when they cooperate with law enforcement. but of course, it's an individual decision that's based on who's actually on the scene.
Very briefly, if the police department where you work doesn't have one of these policies, consider networking with other social service providers in your area and ask them to put one in place. Your testimony that you're giving right now is incredibly powerful and incredibly moving and important. And you speaking as somebody who's on the front lines that can really speak to the kinds of calls and messages that you're getting every day, you're going to be an incredible. One of the best ways you can be an ally is to say, we need one of these policies right now, and here's why. Because women are terrified that they're going to be victims of domestic violence and have no way to do anything about it.
And this is a really nice segue to our next segment and the final segment of the evening, which is really going to focus on protesting and really building an alliance so we can try to not just know our rights, but help others with their rights.